Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Nicholas Davenport, aka Mr. Mental Muscle, here today with Omar Rubio, and we're here in Deerfield Beach, Florida. He's visiting from Corona, California. I met Omar at the ASP 2024 conference, and we hit it off. He had a mutual love for MMA. As you guys already know, if you follow this channel, you know I've worked with numerous MMA fighters, and we started connecting over that. But eventually, we started talking more about the industry as a whole. You guys know I have thoughts on that. But he's here. We're doing some work together. We'll be here for a week or so. So we're going to get a lot of stuff done. So I was like, why not shoot some content? So with that being said, welcome to the show. Welcome to Deerfield. And let's get into it.
Thank you. As he said, my name is Omar Rubio, founder of Foxhound. I appreciate Nick for bringing me out here. You know, he approached me when we did I asked Forrest Griffin a question about weight cutting, and then he came up after me and approached me. And we hit it off and looking to do some good work together.
Yeah, so I know we talked about a few different topics we can go over. So we can talk about several, but let's stick with the MMA route for now, since, like I said, we both have a lot with that. So one of the first ones I know we mentioned of the different levels, right? MMA is a very interesting sport because obviously most sports have tiers. You know, they have the amateur, the semi-pro, the low-level pro, all the way up to the big leagues. In the case of MMA, UFC, it's, I guess, considered big leagues. Now, obviously, there's others, so don't get me in the comments. There's other factions. There's Bellator, but a lot of people see the UFC as the creme de la creme, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's the premier promotion. The way I kind of look at it is that when you're an amateur, you're just like fighting in a high school. And then when you go low-level pro, it's like fighting in college. And then when you make it to the UFC or PFL or ONE, that's like making it to the big leagues, like you said. And I feel like that's kind of like how I break it down when it comes to levels for more people that are familiar with more traditional sports routes.
Yeah, because a lot of people be like, oh, you do UFC? Not realizing UFC is just a brand within MMA. And it's not the only brand. It's kind of like when people think that obviously there's the NFL, but there's also Arena. There's also the XFL. But obviously there's different tiers within those. But with that being said, what's the range of clients you've worked with? I know you mentioned you work with up-and-comers, you work with pros and everything in between. So give us an insight on the types of clients you've worked with.
Yeah, so I've worked with some fighter, mostly a little mix, amateur and pro. Some had a couple fights like as amateurs, like less than 5. Some had about 10. And then typically, actually one of the guys I worked with was amateur, worked from amateur to pro. He done like 8 fights together. And so the most experienced fighter I had has about 14 or 15 fights.
Nice. So I know in my career, I got kind of thrust in the MMA world. I wasn't necessarily not a fan. It was a sport. I'm not really a big sports fan, period. That's the weird thing about me. I played them my whole life. But when I got into the MMA world, I got a very unique situation because if those who know MMA, I worked with numerous athletes who fight out of American Top Team, which is one of the biggest MMA gyms in the world. And so I was very fortunate to get that opportunity. So I was kind of thrust in a position where I had to figure things out in the fly. And when we talk about like mental performance, sports psychology, cognitive training, I'm like, how do I get this to these people? And I know we've talked about this audience for sure pushes back because most like brutal contact sports typically have that more of that macho alpha mentality. So a guy telling them about mindfulness or confidence, they're trying like, I ain't trying to hear that. Like I'll go in a ring or a cage to get beat up. You think I'm not confident, but they don't realize it's more than just believing in yourself. So what do you do with, let's say, from the lower rankings up into the higher rankings of fighters you work with when it comes to like the different things and skills you try to get them to buy in?
Yeah, typically, at least in the beginning stages, I kind of have a similar approach with everybody. You know, I try to like kind of meet them where they're at, as we say. Typically with the less experienced fighters, I'm like a little more cautious when it comes to like maybe trying to help them like develop resilience and stuff because, you know, I don't know exactly how far they're or how committed they are to the sport. And it's a dangerous sport. So like, yeah, and for me, that's kind of a fine line to toe as far as like when it comes to resilience, not even in the fight, like when it comes to making weight, because that's like a dangerous process. So it's like, finding that line of wanting to like make them as mentally tough as they can and push through the extremes. But then it's also like, okay, these are people and they're, you know, essentially dehydrating themselves to dangerous levels that can cause damage to their hormones. So definitely like always very cautious almost with everything that I do, even with the higher levels. But with the higher levels, you at least know like they're committed to the sport. They've been in it a while. They have the experience. So somebody who's been fighting for 2 years versus somebody who's been fighting for 6 years are going to look a little bit different in how I approach for the most part, but kind of backwards because it's a little similar and a little bit different. But, like I said, you try to meet everybody where they're at.
Yeah, and you mentioned something about like injuries. That's a good segue. Obviously, in a sport where kicking, punching, slamming, choking, someone's going to get hurt. It's not if, it's when, and I guess how much and how bad, right? No one's walking into that sport without getting some more wounds, right? So let's talk about like recovering from injury, right? It's one thing to sustain it. Obviously, it's devastating when you pull, tear, break something. I've been through most of those. I've never broken anything, but I've definitely torn plenty. But it's like to come back from it, that seems to be the more detrimental part of it, right?
Yeah, and definitely a common theme when it comes, especially talking about injuries, is like return to sport, because it is like it's a combat sport. So that's what drew me to working with them, because I think it's one thing, like injuries are a part of sport, they happen. But it's another thing too when like the way the sport is designed is to hurt people and inflict damage and injuries. So it's definitely tough. That's kind of another fine balancing act as well, because like, we want people to feel confident in their ability to return. But then we also kind of have to make sure we're cautious, because their rate of injury is significantly higher than other sports, and you don't want to return too quickly. Some people are freaks of nature and, maybe return quicker than they would expect. And some people you got to wait a little bit longer and make sure, because again, you're going to put your body through an extreme amount of physical toll, and that can obviously impact your mental side, which can impact your recovery and the way you perform. So,
and I know me personally, like my knee injury, and I'm not obviously a world class athlete, and I'm not competing in anything, but the mental stress of just getting back to normal, and normal obviously being baseline, because normal is different for everyone. But in the fight world, it's one of those sports where you kind of can push through it, because obviously you can persevere, but it's like, since your body is such a key factor of the performance, right? You know what I mean? Because like, let's say a sport like basketball, if you're kind of hobbled or hurt, you can kind of get away with it, maybe, depending on type of player you are or the position. Like say you're a good shooter, you can maybe make up a little bit for being a little slower because your knee or ankle's hurt. But in MMA, if your ankle's hurt, it's blatantly obvious usually, and then people can pinpoint that. And now, one, you can't work as hard as you want because of the limitation, and two, you're vulnerable. So I think injuries in that sense is even like harder for in the MMA world.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you have a team sport, you can also lean on your team to kind of help you get through it. When you're by yourself, you have no other choice. And for example, I mean, we talk about knee injuries. When sometimes fighters will pad either or wear like a sleeve or kind of like a compression thing for your knee. They usually use it on both, because they don't want one to wear out, because then that person's going to use it as a target. So
that's psychological warfare.
Yeah, and some will even not wear it at all and just risk the chances of, being a little more unstable, having a little less maybe flexibility and stuff like that, just to not even give the opponent an opportunity to think like, oh, this guy's knees are bad, like, let me attack him. Like, yeah, he might have them in both, but we just go for both of them. So, it's definitely a challenging sport when you have to recover from injuries on your own, and then when they're visible like that.
So for people, let's say, who aren't as familiar with MMA, what are the hurdles in the mental performance frame of things, at least, that you deal with for getting that buy-in? Because like you said, they come from a different cut. Like if you do any kind of combat sport, you are automatically cut from a different cloth. It takes a different mindset to get in there one-on-one. Like you said, no teammates, your body on the line. And so what are the type of, I say, pushbacks? Because me and Forrest Griffin talked about this when we did our thing, when it comes to mental performance, because some people see it as woo-woo, mysticism, or lame, or motivational. I've seen it all, heard it all. But I think this sport, from my personal experience, they don't always get it off bat. But what have you seen?
I know one that really stands out is one guy would be like, oh, he's helping me to make me like kind of not be so crazy. And I'm like, well, I want you to be optimally crazy, because you got to, like how you said, you got to be a little wired different to fight. So I'm not going to want you to be necessarily super relaxed and calm and feel like, oh, everything's going to be great, because we're going into a fight here. It's going to be tough, rugged. You're gonna have to have a lot of grit. So, answering your question, yeah. So some of them were resistant because sometimes they feel like it's gonna take away from that edge. Like, you know, you're gonna have your mix of people. Some feel like they need to be dialed back, and some people need to be pushed forward. So, definitely the aspect of like, oh, you know, like kind of being in touch with your feelings and stuff like that, or really understanding what you're going through. Sometimes people are resistant to that because they just want to, well, the sport, the culture of it is like, I just have to grind it out and deal with it and fight through it. I mean, they're fighters, so.
And I think that comes from our side of the field with the industry itself, you know, with the accrediting bodies like ASP or just the field is itself, where you say something like, oh, feelings. And this is my personal gripe, if you will, or what grinds my gears with our industry is that is what most people look at or think of when they hear mental training or sports psych or mental coach. Feelings. And I think it does a disservice because we know the difference between, say, a clinical psychologist or a therapist and what we do in a practical sense. But the mainstream people aren't going to get that. So for them to really override that thinking of, oh, look at this, we're going to do some kumbaya type stuff. I mean, you might do some kumbaya stuff, like people get on box breathing and all that stuff, and that's a great tool. You can measure with HRV. But there's other sides to it, like using myself again. My big claim to fame was obviously I got to work with some very prominent names. But be fair, that was even harder because they have more room to say, F this. I'm a world champion, or I've competed to be a world champion. Why do I need to listen to this guy talking about this, mental that? So it gave me kind of like an insight of how do I attack? And that's always what I look at for our industry is how do we attack it? Like you say, meet them where they're at. But I think that goes a little further than just saying what level they're on, what mindset they're on. I think it also goes to saying, assuming in a sense, what they will need where they're at. You know what I mean? Because it's like, it's not enough to say, okay, maybe they're not open to X, Y, and Z. That's part one. I think part two is, okay, they're not open to X, Y, and Z. They're open to this, but how do I make that relevant to them? And that's where I think a lot of our field misses the mark on why they only assume we're going to go, how do you feel? What is your day like? Like that isn't this, but that's what people think it is.
Yeah, that kind of reminded me of another thing that kind of causes some resistance was I don't have any experience in combat sports. So like I practiced jiu-jitsu for maybe like 2 to 3 years, like on and off at my school, and did like some training at like actual jiu-jitsu gyms. And I remember one guy is like, well, are you going to fight? And I'm like, no way. Like, I'm not into fighting. Like, and he's like, well, don't you need to know, like, to go through it, to know what it feels like? And I'm like, I could get a pretty good idea of what it feels like by just communicating with you, you know? Like, of course, if I go through it myself, yeah, I'll have a greater understanding. But I like to believe I'm smart enough where I can understand just by your experience. So that's another kind of resistant thing that people will be hesitant to, like, oh, you know, can this guy actually help me? Because he doesn't know what it's like to make this walk. And like, yeah, I don't know, but I can put myself in a situation like that. And again, it's not going to be 100% of what your experience was. But even if I did it, my experience wouldn't be 100% of what yours was, because we're different people and we respond differently. So even if I did do it, it would still be different.
And that's why I actually use an example of that with, like, say, medicine, right? There's doctors who deliver babies that are men who can never physically deliver a baby. There's people who treat people with cancer who's never had cancer. So I think when people do that, it's a defense mechanism / cop out. And I, once again, don't put it on the client or the potential client. I put it back on us. Like, that's one thing about me. People think I talk outwardly and this and that, but I take accountability, because it's like the only reason they would say something like, oh, you've never been through this, because they probably work 9 out of 10. They've worked with someone in this field or similar field who didn't come with the right, like, approach, where they didn't understand the sport. Because I've had people tell me, and who I've worked with said, yeah, this guy came in or this girl came in and she was trying to do all this, but she didn't even understand what it took to be just as athletes. She's just trying to preach these techniques. And that happens a lot more. So it's on us to just meet them, like, say, where they're at in the sense of what do they need, versus just like, oh, I'm a sports psych or a mental coach that is just going to give my services to whoever. You don't have to be a soccer player. You don't have to be an MMA fighter, but you need to understand that probably a tier or two below them. Like, you'll never be their tier, but like, I'm making myself personally, when I get into a new sport, I work with pickleball, I work with bowling, MMA was new at one point. I have sports like football, baseball, and track that I know very well. But the ones I don't, I make my duty to read numerous articles, research and non-research, watch numerous videos of the top and worst performers. So by the time we have our first session, I'm if I've never played or heard that sport before, I know enough about it. Skeleton, one of our athletes are in the Winter Olympics right now. I will never do that sport 9 out of 10 because you got to have a whole bunch of stuff to do it. You need an ice track, you need a sled, you need a lot. So I probably will never do skeleton unless he invites me to say try it one day. But I had to figure that out. And I work with him longer than almost any of my clients. So it's like we really got to do our due diligence to become them so they don't say stuff like that.
And I think obviously depending on the person as well, but I think sometimes when you don't know, I think like it offers an interesting perspective as well. So like I used to record sparring and we would review their tapes and all that stuff. And I remember I try to refrain from giving my 2 cents because I don't know technique and I don't know this and I don't like when you're there a lot, you can kind of learn a little bit about tactics, but not necessarily. I'm not going to pretend like I know like a high level MMA coach knows, but I was there for an extended period of time. So I like to believe I at least have some understanding of what good tactics would be. And one thing that a lot of MMA fighters do is they complain about the judges. They're like, oh man, they don't know anything. So I'm like, hey, maybe when I give you feedback, think of me as a judge because, I don't know to the same degree that you know. And all of the fighters say the judges don't know to the degree that they know. So I was like, take any feedback if you ask for feedback and I give it to you, take it with, a grain of salt and understand like, yeah, this is a alternative perspective for somebody that's not in it, or I guess maybe in it adjacently. And then think about, okay, well, these are what judges feel like. So, because I would hold kind of fight night sparring where we would run through everything, fight music. Fortunately, the gym we were at, they had a cage, nice lighting. So we made it pretty legit. And the funny thing was on the last one that we did, I think we had 6 people spar. So we had 6, 15 or 3 by 5 rounds, so 15 minutes for each 6 people, unless the fight finished. Like if somebody got submitted, you were done for the night, unless everybody went and they wanted to go again. And on the last fight of the night, of course, everybody was split on who did better and who did worse. And I was like, oh, wow, I didn't expect this, but this is perfect because this is exactly what you guys go through on a regular basis as far as bad decisions and stuff like that. So I thought it was such a, sometimes you go in an idea, hoping how it's going to work out. And it actually started really rough with if we got 2 people get injured in 2 of the sparring rounds. And I was like, oh man, this is turning into a disaster, even though that is part of the sport because, I don't want my athletes to get hurt sparring each other. But they had pre-existing injuries and fortunately, neither of them were severe, but it was severe enough to where we're like, hey, you're not sparring for the rest of the night because we don't want to turn this into something worse, especially for the ones that had fights coming up.
Yeah. So being aware, that's another thing. So yeah, all in all, being in that field, MMA, I know that was the general topic, but obviously we talked about a little bit of other things. It just comes down to being aware of it, meaning where they're at, and just doing the right things, whatever that may look like, but making sure it's to the emphasis where it's not just something that's, I hate to say cookie cutter, because a lot of times that's what dissuades people because they're not dumb. They may not know our field, but they understand when they've heard something that how much, we talked about this, how much self-talk can you really do? How much journaling can you really do? Some people are going to reject that, not because it's dumb or they don't like it. It's just, I need something else. You can't just keep pulling out the diagnosis or the tool, well, not diagnosis, but the tools for the what's going on just because you have them in your bag. Maybe you need to go find the tool. You know what I'm saying? Learn more tools. That's all it is. But yeah, so let's wrap up with that. This is one. You're here for a while, so we'll do a few more. So guys, thanks for tuning in. You're going to check those out later. And as always, get your mind right.